Investigations and Incident Response Challenges and Solutions for the Modern Enterprise. Please welcome your panel.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming on the last day for an early morning session. That's awesome to see so many folks here. My name is Yoran. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Command Zero. So we are a startup in stealth, still, looking at the investigation space and the incident response space. And I've had a career long in cyber. I'd love for the panel to also give a moment of their background and say hi.
Sure. I'm Andy Ozment. I'm the Chief Tech Risk Officer at Capital One. Before that, I was the Chief Information Security Officer at Goldman Sachs. And then prior to that, I had a career in government spanning DHS, the White House, and the Department of Defense.
It's a tough one to follow. I'm Dave Damato. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Aon. Prior to that, I was at a company called Gemini. I worked for the Winklevoss twins, securing about $30 billion in assets under management in crypto. Prior to that, I was at a company called Tanium, and then I got my start in cybersecurity as an early employee at a company called Mandiant.
I'm Stacey Halota. I'm the Vice President of Information Security and Privacy for Graham Holdings. Prior to Graham, I've been there for 20 years, but prior to Graham, I was a consultant for PwC and other consulting companies in information security and privacy.
Ron Plesco, partner at DLA Piper, running cyber incident response privacy. 4 years there, 8 years doing the same thing for Big Four, KPMG. 8 years global nonprofit that shares cyber threat intelligence information amongst 3,000 companies, 34 countries, still on the board there. DHS, early day formation of the Department of Homeland Security, NCSD, what you know today as CISO, law enforcement intelligence community background. Super excited to talk to you all about this today, and I will turn one of my ringers off, so sorry about that.
And the obligatory disclaimer, which no one really cares about other than Ron and all the lawyers in the room. So,
bring them the love.
Fast forward right along. Just a quick minute or two on the background. So this past year, we conducted over 250 interviews with folks that are involved in the cyber investigation. So at enterprises, some service providers, and the like, but from CISOs on down to practitioners that are in the trenches doing the investigation work. And the idea was to actually sit down and actually hear them. So it wasn't a survey, it was 30 to 60 minutes in length. And what we're going to talk about is sort of the qualitative observations that came from this. So this isn't sort of scientific in nature, but general themes that really stood out from those conversations. And a quick snapshot on who and sort of what the audience looked like from the interviews. A really good representation on the industries, so 15 verticals well represented. A majority were, or bulk, 20% that were in financial services. It had a good stake in services in general, and then technology companies. So forward-thinking, forward-leaning, but a lot of other sort of industries had really good representation. And on the company profile size, again, a good even balance of Fortune 500 and Global 2000, so almost a third, another third, or 20 some odd percent of public companies, but not at the sort of Fortune global size. And then about 45% or so private entities, and then a good sliver of government as well. So a good diverse group, so there's no sort of one dominant industry or company profile that stood out. And so what kind of came through was really 4 thematic, general takeaways. And so we'll talk about each one of those over the course of the event, over the course of the conversation here. And the first one is, hybrid environments and sort of the complexities in securing them. And it was interesting because, 75% of the respondents, talked about, are they actually collecting all of the data during an investigation? Are they actually getting all the information during a breach that they need? And only a third of them felt confident in actually tracking an incident from the cloud or from legacy through the cloud. So you have, modern computing with SaaS and then also cloud infrastructure. and sort of that whole new chasm of how to conduct an investigation in that medium, as well as obviously the legacy around data center and CPE and servers and endpoints and laptops. And the ability to track among both of those has been a real challenge for a variety of reasons, which we'll also talk about here. About 80%, a pretty large majority of them, talk about SaaS logs as a pretty essential part of the investigation, but less than half are really actually incorporating that information and those SaaS events into their complete picture of the investigation. And I'd say it was almost universal reliance on third parties, which isn't shocking, given the shortage of talent, but the implication is, the ability and the scale and the expense and all those things really are, all hands on deck to hit one major incident, a year or hopefully less, was almost all enterprises and organizations talked about. So that was the general theme of what we'd found as sort of the interviews, and I'd love to turn it over to Andy if you had thoughts or comments on any one of those.
The only thing I'd say is I don't think it's just a talent that makes people use external incident responders. It's the fact that hopefully you aren't dealing with that many incidents, and so you're just not going to get that much practice, and it doesn't make sense to have your own team who's skilled and focused on incident response and then not having to do a lot of incident response. So I also just think it's a naturally outsourced capability.
And then, from my perspective, just looking at those stats, I'm not surprised. I think everyone in here is probably feeling the same pain of the economic climate and saving money. And one thing that costs a lot of money is logs and searching logs. And so in large organizations, you can spend a lot of money, and it's very difficult to track down all the logs and events you need. So I think this is just a very challenging area to get right. You need to know what logs you need, how long you need them for, how to reduce them and use them effectively, how quickly can you search them, how quickly can you rehydrate old logs if you have an investigation. It is a very expensive and time-consuming component within an information security program. So none of this surprises me. And then the other thing is some of our vendors make us pay for logs when they're SaaS solutions, and so that's never a pleasant experience either. So there's a lot of complexity in this area, and so I'm not overly surprised, and I think we'll see improvements in this over time as people start to use different types of data sources for different types of data, and as we get more experience in this space and more practice, like to your point.
You don't like paying for logs?
Well, I don't mind it. It's my superiors who don't mind it, so I
all
don't
right.
like it so much.
It's a feature.
From my perspective, I think that having a program to understand where your crown jewels are, particularly as you're branching out into different environments, is really important to target your incident response capabilities. I was really excited. I think we're kind of on the verge of really benefiting from the research that's been done in AI. And I was really excited to hear about some technology that instead of creating an enormous data lake, actually federated the kind of looking at different SaaS and traditional environments, and then used AI to basically analyze the data. From basically partnering with an incident response provider when you do have an incident. I think that, to Andy's point, in the best case scenario, you're not dealing with complicated incidents every day. And having that expertise when the stakes are so high, you want to respond quickly, and basically make sure that, if you're dealing with customer or employee data, you want to, respond quickly and appropriately to an incident. And I think having that external expertise on call is really important. So those are my thoughts.
So I'm going to talk from two perspectives. I'm not a typical lawyer, to be honest. Forensics.
Sure.
Yeah, he
We've
says
all heard
it.
that.
Sorry, also just stand-up comedy on the side. So two perspectives. One, my training's in forensics and investigation, and also a lawyer. So I'm going to give you the forensic side of this. I ran teams, done over 1,000 investigations, either hands-on keyboard or teams that I run. The last 24 hours, what I just got was a data extortion case yesterday. This morning, a pretty large law firm in the United States has been hacked into. Their third-party all their clients' data potentially is exposed, so their clients are calling us. And I talked to one of their clients today, and the issue is where are the logs? And so this 32% does not surprise me. The challenge in getting at that data, especially if you're a third party trying to tell the law firm that lost the data through one of their clients, how do we get at that? I'm allowed to say this one publicly. My team and I ran the SolarWinds investigation. So we had CrowdStrike and KPMG running that. All that's public. The challenge there was 100 terabytes of data in log data to get through that in 6 weeks. A massive data effort. So not surprising on the 32% piece. The last piece, I'll hit you from the legal perspective. The reliance on third parties is also good from a legal standpoint. Maintenance of chain of custody by individuals that are trained in maintaining chain of custody for presentation in either court and or to law enforcement or intelligence community is important. So using third-party forensics providers that have that kind of training, if your team doesn't have that's why you want to do that. The second piece is something that I call, from a chain of command standpoint, a throat to choke. You can literally point to that third-party vendor if something goes wrong. It's not your team per se, it's that third-party vendor's team that had a problem. It's not uncommon these days when you have a large breach incident to have another third-party team doing a shadow investigation or an independent verification and validation of the investigation that the actual team's doing. An audit committee or the board will bring in those type of teams. So not surprised at these stats at all. So.
Yeah, I bet you'd probably like the last stat where there's a reliance on third parties to come in. The gift that keeps on giving, I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah, it is a business development for us. Yeah, self-effacing. Yeah, we make money off of that.
The next theme, the second theme that we found was kind of sort of setting a picture of what were the tools that everybody was using. And nothing here is probably going to be too shocking, but I mean, I guess the universal appeal of 80% plus ADR was their workload during investigation. Throwing it in, collecting their information makes perfect sense. That 90% of the practitioners looked at the network data as critical, but I thought it was surprising that less than half are actually collecting network traffic flow data and the ability of that. I know Dave mentioned earlier about logging. 3/4 of those interviewed talked about how much the SIM, again, not a surprise, would be a widely adopted platform, and the workbench to some extent, but the limited collections and the retentions and the cost is often hamstrung that to be even more widely used. And then 2/3, concerned about staffing and operationalizing the SIM. There's not only the cost of the SIM, but the expenses around fully utilizing them. And then I thought it was interesting, only 1/3 of organizations automated non-security data into their investigation. So it's interesting that, yes, we automatically go to our security tool, but oftentimes you need to reach out to the non-security parts of the environment to complete the full picture of an investigation. So, yeah, I'd love to hear thoughts on.
How many people in this room are happy with their SIM? All right, we've got a handful. That's exciting. How many people are unhappy with their SIM? That is a less lopsided ratio than I expected, to be honest.
How many people don't know what a SIM is?
Good clarification question.
I'll be here all night.
I don't know. When I talk to fellow CISOs, I hear a lot of frustration with SIMs. And one of the things that I think people don't think enough about when they're starting off with a new SIM or when they're increasing their ability to capture logs is just how the more time you spend upstream on the logging, the better off you are, even if your SIM has limitations. And I'll give an example. Particularly when you're in the cloud, you can generate so many logs. And I know Fortune 100 organizations, just from talking to peers, a handful of them are capturing on the order of 50 to 150 terabytes of logs a day and trying to feed it into their SIM. And let me tell you, it's going badly. Like the SIMs cannot handle that level of flow. And And so the things that I hear people working on are, first of all, there are folks doing, at that scale, doing custom SIMs because they're just not satisfied with the market. But the other thing that they're working on is standardizing log formats, taking one of the industry standards, trying to move to that. And also just spending so much time trying to prune the logs before they get to the SIM. Like, which logs do we really need? Because I feel like in your initial step of maturity, it's very natural to just like, we don't have enough logs being captured, we're not capturing network traffic, whatever. So like your goal is just grab something and throw it into the system. And that's probably the right response at the initial stage when you don't have enough logging being captured and you just need to increase it. But pretty quickly you need to pivot to, okay, I've got enough in there now. How can I start pruning it so that my costs are less over the top? And then also so that I can continue to scale effectively and not overwhelm my tooling. And so I think that's just the data management side of logging is so critical.
I'd say the other thing too that's emerging now is you have all these distributed tools that we use, and they all contain their own data. And in the past, we used to just say, let's centralize all that data and try and correlate it and make alerts. And I will say that the majority of time, that's not how our alerts are generated. They're not advanced or crazy correlations between network data and host data. It's now sort of contained within these platforms. So you may have a host-based platform, you have your cloud platform, you have your network platform, and they're generating alerts, and there may be some things you want to sort of stitch together there, but generally they're doing that alerting for you, and you're bringing that together to create a single workflow for your analysts. So it's instead of the correlation, it's how can we stitch this together to make our analysts more efficient and help them understand what actually just occurred more quickly. And so a lot of the SOAR platforms, I've been heavily leveraging automation now. Instead of bringing things together during the sort of like as a stream, bringing it together during the time an alert is generated. So reaching out to different systems, different data stores, putting together a case for an analyst and either solving it in an automatic fashion or presenting them with all the information required to let them know how to solve that case or relate it to another case that was performed in the past. So I think there's a lot of options now. Instead of bringing everything together and creating these huge centralized data stores, we can create things that are a little bit more distributed and more efficient and sort of make things easier for our analysts to draw better detections.
Like that works badly if you just take your single platform alert and send it to the analyst. What you're describing is you take your single platform alert, send it to your SOAR, which then goes out and grabs enriching data.
Correct.
And then
what are
does
the cases,
what you would have expected.
IP addresses, other hashes, other intel sources, previous cases, all that data comes together, pulling a live response from an endpoint, memory analysis. So instead of an analyst having to go and gather all those things, which is the most time-consuming part of when I would do an investigation, it's just all there.
Yeah, and then hopefully closes a lot of those cases automatically.
You can,
concludes it like nothing to see here.
Yep.
Yeah, fair enough.
So a couple years ago, Mandiant did a study, and what they did is they basically worked with a lot of organizations, and they tested them, and they launched attacks against the organization to see if they were detected. And I think almost 60% of the attacks weren't detected. So I think one other important thing is in our increasingly complex environments, having validation that as you're monitoring, are you actually detecting what you, you're not going to know every attack, but attacks like the MITRE framework and things like that, and actually testing your capabilities to see if you're actually picking up common attacks.
Yeah, so I'm going to come at this from a couple angles. That's the beauty of going last, so I get to hear everybody else, of course. So EDRs, my team's we're EDR agnostic. We're not just all attorneys. We have a bunch of forensics experts that I've worked with over the years that oversee the teams like CrowdStrike or Palo Alto Networks, whoever. The EDR stat there is concerning to me. So those of you that have been trained in forensics and you're dealing with the latest threats, whether it's a data extortion or a right-hand, left-hand thing where it looks like a data extortion, but it's actually nation state taken IP, that's now unfortunately in vogue because of the weaponization of cyber weapons from Russia after the Ukraine invasion. So EDR is missing a lot, depending upon configuration. And when I say that, some of the best tools, Falcon, fantastic tool, Palo Alto's Cortex XDR, et cetera, all fantastic tools. S1, Sentinel-1, that configuration piece, though, is key. And what we do in those type of cases is that EDR is the initial look at the processes, but then it's, do we have a forensic pool? So Falcon has FFC, Falcon Forensic Collector. do we actually do an OS pull? The threat actors are very adept at these days disabling EDR in destruction of logs, secondary and tertiary logs. So the issue is where are your backups. The other concern that I have is shadow IT. So if you think about HR and other organizations inside of a large corporate organization, they might use a third-party vendor, SASE or SaaS, to assist them with HR. The logs, as the panel said, are sitting there with that third-party vendor. Can you actually readily get at that information? The last time you want to, the worst possible time to try to find out the answers to these questions I'm asking, especially the third-party logs, is when you're in the middle of an incident, where you're trying to call up the head of HR to get at that SaaS product, fill in the blank, great companies, Workday, to figure out what IP addresses actually got into that system when those logs are sitting there inside of the management console. So that's the challenge, I think. The other one I want to hit on is this 31% of the organizations trying to automate. Your automation is just as good, is only as good as the data sources that you automate. And what are you missing? And so what I've found is a lot of forensics experts tend to just read the results of their tooling, and not think like an investigator or think like a threat actor to figure out how they would get in, how they would move horizontally, what data they would interact with and or exfiltrate. And so in that automation, are you considering that? So that's just my perspective in working these cases. So.
I would also, on that 31% point, I mean, what I read there is that these are companies that are not prioritizing insider threat.
Yeah, that's right.
Because you cannot do an insider threat, even basic insider threat detections, without having some non-security data. Like that HR data is so critical for insider threat. And maybe these are organizations and industries where that's considered less of a risk. But I think if you're in the audience and you're like, yep, I'm in the 70% that don't have data from outside the security world, then you need to ask yourself, do I care about insider threat? And if so, then I need to go get some of that data.
Yeah, and I'll throw on, what are you automating? Because last year at this time we had the SAML token, Microsoft's unfortunate vulnerability with SAML token compromise. So if you know what I'm talking about there, if you're automating known, meaning, hey, Ron's allowed in, Dove's allowed in because he works for the organization, but yet his SAML token was compromised, and therefore somebody has his creds and they're acting inside, you're not going to necessarily see that to your insider threat point. Because it's accepted traffic. Hey, Dove's allowed to do this unless you have rights, privileges on him. So that's to me that's the challenge in automation. So.
Yeah, no, totally agree. The shortage of skilled labor and the workforce in cyber is probably universal in every submarket within cyber. So this is absolutely not shocking to say within incident response in the investigation world, this also is highly exacerbated. So 85%, I mean, these are such large percentage of respondents and interviewees concerned around skilled staff and the attrition rates. 2/3 having, responded around burnout and, the operational risk. And, an interesting part of that is, the teams having that expert internal or in-house, and sort of the inherent knowledge that he or she has built up, and even homegrown tools that he or she, and sort of the pitfall of what happens if that individual leaves, and sort of all this inherent knowledge and some of these homegrown tools walks out the door with that person, is also that was sort of like an anecdotal side note for folks that raised concern around that. But I think the biggest impact is you blow the whistle and you have that uh-oh moment. It's one, everyone's working around that one major breach, and obviously everything else suffers. So that's why the breadth of the interviewed audience, from analysts in the trenches up to CISO, it just gathers the attention. So that's all byproducts of a shortage of skilled labor. So Ron, we'll start with you this time.
Oh, geez, bring it my way. I was thinking to myself, a lot of different issues. The second one, poor career choice for the people that do this, right? Because I love what I do. I don't know if it's a dopamine hit, but we definitely have a body by breach. I mean, you literally sometimes are 17, 18-hour days. So the challenge I think that we have in the space, especially pure incident response teams, whether they're outside teams or internal teams, is the ops tempo is insane. Operational tempo, how much you have to work. And a lack of management prioritization of business risk related to data sets and not knowing what data sets necessarily are where adds to that ops tempo. Our guys, our teams are always being recruited. Anyone I talk to is always being recruited. It is like minus 34% unemployment if you do cyber IR, according to the last study that I saw. But the burnout is a real thing. If I think about our teams, we, like I said, poor career choice. We run 24/7, sleep with our phones. But the flip side of that is that all hands on deck piece. I'm working with a client right now that just had an incident 2 weeks ago, a data extortion for 10 mil. Now they have another threat actor and totally other threat actor for another 5 mil. And that team is burnt out. I mean, that team cannot sustain that, including the outside IR teams. So understanding the freshness of teams and your team's capabilities. During the one incident I referenced to you, I called in favorites just to get the A teams from, let's be honest, there are A team, B teams, C teams, and D teams at all the IR vendors out there. Just because you run a 24/7, 365 shop like that, and you have core capabilities, you have to be able to identify those individuals with those capabilities and who can serve. From my standpoint, is knowing who to call and knowing what teams aren't burnt out and where they're at. The better programs realize that last piece or the second piece and cycle people through and let people take breaks. Unfortunately, most organizations don't have that luxury. They don't have enough people. So.
Ron, though, I think you should be thinking about this positively, which is you guys are staying young. You're running 24/7. You're sleeping with your phone, so you're a teenager.
That's right. I'm 90, but yeah, that looks like it. So, yeah, I love it. Yeah.
You're living your fullest life.
There you go.
It's a dopamine hit. It's all fun. So.
Stacey?
Yeah. Looking at the first point and just thinking about the development of a cyber information security workforce. So basically, I wouldn't be where I am today unless I was mentored. And basically, I have a kind of a non-traditional education. And so my first company, I was in a very junior position, and I accidentally, well, you know what drive mapping is. So I mapped a drive, and I thought I had actually copied all of our company's data, and so I deleted the drive that I mapped. And so my boss came to me and he said, "Why did you do that?" And I told him, he said, "Well, that makes sense. So why don't we get you some training, and so you're not so dangerous anymore." And so he was my, basically a mentor to me. And I've had several mentors like that kind of brought me along. I'm an ambassador for an organization called Cybersecurity. And what Cybersecurity does is it promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion in the cyber workforce, because I think you all are probably aware that women and minorities and veterans as well are underrepresented in cyber. And so one of the things that one of the co-founders said actually a couple days ago at a meeting was that if you're a hiring manager, please work with your HR group, because some of your traditional, like if I applied for a CISO job now, I wouldn't be qualified based on my education. So it's kind of, just on that qualification. So look at your job descriptions and consider bringing people in as apprentices, and basically bring them in and mentor them, and you'll greatly benefit from the things that they bring to the table. So just something to consider.
That's great. So from my standpoint, I've done both incidents from a consulting perspective, which I found exhilarating and fun. There's something about just landing in a random city, not having enough clothes, going to have to go to Walmart to buy more because you're staying there for the next 2 weeks.
We call that tomorrow.
And at the same time, I've done it internally as well. I can say that the stress and burnout from an internal perspective is significant, because you're having to support your staff. You're the single point of contact for the company. It's one of those crises that everyone has their eyes on you. And so I think burnout from an internal perspective, I think is a huge challenge for most organizations. And the biggest thing I've found is that as security practitioners, we do a very bad job of prioritizing. We want to solve all the problems. We want to address all the risks. We want to have perfect security. And we have to acknowledge that that's never going to be possible. There's always going to be some amount of risk. And working with our leadership to define that risk appetite, prioritization of items and gaps that we're addressing, so that we can maintain that sanity and build the security program over time. And that has helped me over the decades as an internal CISO, try and sort of find that balance and not run like crazy like during the consulting days to just solve everything, because you just don't have that capacity. So that's just some of my learnings, I guess.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about burnout, and so far with the flavor of burnout for people who are doing active response. But I'm just as worried about burnout from my day-to-day security operations people who are getting a lot of false positives, spending their time investigating them and dispositioning them. And so, I encourage you to think about that as well. And I've been having a debate with some other CISOs about sort of what is the right false positive rate for your security operations people, right? Like, if you think about this as, I'll give you an example. When I worked at DHS, I was the cybersecurity guy, what's now CISA, and so we'd have staff meetings, and the TSA guy would be there too. And the TSA person was like, for them, a TSA screener could spend their whole year and never hit a true positive, right? And if you define true positive as a malicious person smuggling a gun through, they could spend their whole career and never hit a true positive. And so how do you keep them engaged, right? You spend some time, you put some fake guns through the system to give them excitement. But the upside of it is the cost of investigating a false positive is low for that screener. So they can just flag things, somebody else investigates them, it doesn't take a ton of time. And so it's okay to have a much higher rate of false positives with TSA screeners. You still have to worry about it, but it's okay. With a security person, you give them a false positive alert, it's pretty hard to disposition those alerts rapidly. And so they might spend 2 or 3 days investigating a false positive alert. That's incredibly disheartening. And so we've been talking about, is a 25% false positive rate too many false positives? Probably so. I've talked to companies that say, you know what, 60% is what we're targeting. We want to have, sorry, I've said false positive, but essentially we only want 1 in 3 alerts to be a false positive. We want 2 out of 3 to be true positives. Meaning, on average, when you're investigating an alert, it's going to be a real thing. I think if you can tune your systems to that, that's fantastic. The flip side, of course, is what I always worried about, is if you're tuning to your system so that most of what you see is a true positive, then what are you missing, right? Like, what actual incidents are you screening out? And so there's this real tension when you manage the burnout of your teams. And obviously the dream is you don't miss anything. You've got your alerts so carefully tuned that all the true incidents are identified as such. But that's not life, right? There's always a trade-off. When you turn that knob, if you want to catch a higher rate of true positives, then you are going to miss more things at the boundaries. And so, that's something I encourage you to spend some time working on and thinking about with your team, which is what is our target for our percentage of true positives, and what does that mean for burnout? And you should be tracking that over time. How does our burnout change as we turn that knob?
Yeah, it's interesting. I never really thought about the frustration part of it, of working it for so long. Like, yeah, okay. I mean, it's actually better that it dissipated, and it wasn't a real event, but it could be frustrating when you think you want to ring the bell.
Deeply frustrating, yeah.
The last key theme that sort of came out from the interview sessions was this whole notion around communications and collaboration. And it was interesting because there's some things that really stood out here about 90% of those cited sort of a lack of a standard collab tool, and sort of how they're sort of doing their jobs and managing the evidence. And often it's just Excel or Wiki or Google Docs or Slack seem to be sort of the prevailing thoughts, but there wasn't like a universal, or it was evenly distributed amongst all these as, hey, there's always issues going on here, and how do we pull it together in a timely way. Most, good 80%, 78% talked about the length of time, and more so the disruption to management and folks on the panel, or probably peers of folks on the panel, of status update, what's going on in the investigation, where are we, and everyone's on pins and needles and on the edge, but that is highly disruptive to the analyst working the event, working the case. What I think was really interesting is almost 2/3, or a little more than 2/3, did not programmatically link their learning. So the takeaways of, here's the investigation, we ran it through, and you learn all this sort of byproduct, all this information, sort of what had happened, what did not happen, and those lessons are great, but they weren't really applied back into the practice, into the operation. Into the technology you have, into the processes. They're great training grounds for sort of bringing on new team members into investigation process. There's just so many valuable things. I was surprised that that's not done more consistently. And then, for those that are public or highly regulated industries, more than 80% talked about the pains of the regulatory compliance and the reporting. So public, international, state, and other vertical industries, that's probably not surprising. But I'm curious how, and maybe we'll start with Stacey this time, what your thoughts are on this.
I'm actually going to start on the last bullet. And I think I'm a big believer in kind of storytelling. And I think one of the things that's important to an organization to kind of drive home the criticality of preparing for incidents is doing tabletop exercises and bringing in not just the security response, but also the legal response that would be required. And it's interesting because we actually have mandatory incident response exercises at our company that, across, we're decentralized and diverse industries. But one of the things that has come out of that is just an increased awareness of just how we respond. It's a tremendous learning opportunity, bringing in different parts of the organization, from executives, technical people and everything else, and just having those conversations, I think is tremendously beneficial to an organization. When you're basically justifying, the costs of, your information security program, having that awareness, it really brings it home when you're going through, the complex legal environment and the, bringing in things like data from your business impact assessment. So if I'm having a tabletop exercise and we're talking about a system, I can bring in data from the BIA that, for example, if the system is down for an hour, it's going to cost, $100,000, an hour. And then going through kind of the legal response of, and if this pool of people are basically part of the compromise, then you have this legal response globally. And so for things like the GDPR, it's a 72-hour basically notification, and the SEC is actually considering that as well. So I think kind of making it real through these exercises is really important from an awareness perspective.
Yeah, it segues in the last bullet from a legal standpoint. I totally agree. Well, we're spending a lot of time writing run books for the C-level. So those of you that have run books and playbooks inside of your incident response plan for different scenarios, what we're seeing for the C-level is the exact same thing, and it's not in technical speak. It's pretty much to deal with the situations you just talked about. And what most people don't realize, if they don't have a data mapping during an incident, NYDFS requirement within days, GDPR has said 72 hours, and you're not going to know what the heck went on within that period of time. So you're talking to legal maybe for the first time to say, hey, you got to file something because you're doing a placeholder with the regulators. The other side that I wanted to hit is Slack and all those tools, if not done correctly, all that is it's fodder for plaintiff and regulatory lawsuits against you and regulatory action, meaning as you communicate in Slack, oh shit, we forgot to update this vulnerability, or we didn't patch this log4j for 10 months, right? You're saying that in Slack, and if you don't protect it under attorney-client privilege, which isn't your inside counsel, all that chat can go to regulators like the SEC and others if they request it, which I've seen them request it. So those platforms, while great, you got to realize what do you say on those and how do you communicate on those, and also a lot of the incidents that I've worked, the threat actors are actually monitoring the Slack channel for the comms. So you got to figure out before containment and eviction, can you actually use those? Last piece I'll leave you with is just lack of project management knowledge amongst teams. Teams are really good to work parts. Being the true quarterback, I unfortunately have a project management certification. I've seen the IR response teams actually hire project managers now to help assist any given incident. There's 7 to 9 real-time work streams taking place during that incident, one of which is the investigation, containment, and eviction. So that's one. The rest are complex regulatory notice communications, things such as that. So understanding exactly what's taking place there and who's going to run that. And oh, by the way, you all have day jobs. You all have your other work that you have to do while you have an incident, and that's the challenge here. So,
Ron, can I push on one of the points you made? And I'm not an attorney, Ron is, so this is a question for an attorney. Yeah. My understanding, at least with financial regulators, is that putting something under privilege does not protect it with respect to regulatory discovery.
Depends. Yeah, so it's a great question. So I sound like such a damn lawyer. Depends. Sorry. Oh, this is all on video. This is great.
Keep going.
Yeah. So I give you the depends because it does depend. So you can push back. So you can fight. So the rule of thumb that non-law, I'll explain it to you in a non-legal way. Facts are never privileged. So facts, what happened, how did it happen, what was impacted, you can never protect that. What you want to protect is your decisioning, your criteria, your back and forth, the smoking guns. Oh, damn, we didn't do this. Or, oh, that was Jack's fault. Remember Jack left and didn't, that type of stuff. Regulators would love to have that, right? So, of course, so would plaintiffs' attorneys. And we're sitting in California. There's a lot of plaintiffs' counsel that are learning how to sue corporations during breaches. And what they do is they monitor state attorney general sites and regulator sites for breach notifications, so then they target you and come after you in either single or class actions. So there's 3 cases, started with, Cap One, and then in progeny from Cap One, all the way to a convenience store chain in my home state, Pennsylvania, all trying to argue privilege over an incident response. And those cases are really telling, but basically the output of those cases is facts never privileged, and if you have an incident response vendor under an MSA or a work order, and they've been working with you, and all of a sudden you engage them. If you don't engage them the right way, it's not privileged. You can't put toothpaste back into the tube is another way to look at it. You're already engaging them. Hey, look at this. Tell us what's going on. Oh, damn, it's bad. Let's call the attorneys and try to wrap this thing under privilege. Well, it might be a little too late. So there's your CLE moment for the day. For the continuing legal education. I realize my acronyms aren't everybody's acronyms.
So on sort of the conclusion, what to do, where to go from here. Some of the general ideas that came through is sort of enhancing your data collection, automation, automation, especially as the world is moving and continues to, propel itself towards digitization and cloud, and it's just sort of universally accepted in logical sense that more automation the better. With context, of course. Using engineering cycles, we talked a little earlier about incorporating non-security data into your breach investigations, right? There's just a wealth of information around your company and your organizational assets and tools and other products that you're using. Sort of a budding part of the industry that's emerging, these unified investigation and IR platforms and solutions. So it's cutting part of the industry that's emerging. So those are really interesting sort of target vendors that are specifically focusing and addressing these challenges. The big part of this is how do you implement and care for the employees? Workload management strategy. Perhaps rotating folks through different aspects of the operation. Continuous training and education. Stacey highlighted some of the early in career challenges she had. But these were the sort of some of the overarching nuggets that kind of came away that made sense to us as we sort of gathered that feedback. But I'd love to hear what you guys think about this. Andy.
I think this makes sense. I particularly tend to focus on the engineering cycles for the different data sources, for the automation, the data collection. Look, I think this is fundamentally stuff that makes sense, and I think this is these are problems that we're all struggling with. And what is most startling to me is that we've been struggling with them for 20 years.
Forever, yeah.
Longer than that, but at scale for 20 years, and that we're not seeing the products and services that we really need to make the progress that we all want to make. So that's the most frustrating part of it to me.
Yeah. And I'd say, from an engineering perspective, the thing that's changing pretty rapidly, we had, when I was doing investigations 10 years ago, it was primarily focused on endpoints. Yeah. Now it's changing considerably, whereas most of the investigations I see involve non-security data from an engineering perspective in application logs, cloud control planes, things like that. So it's requiring a shift, and a lot of companies now are creating product certs. They have their typical cert, they have a product side, and so it's becoming much more complex. And so all these strategies, I think, are really important to bring together all the information required to go from what I consider a legacy investigation to a modern investigation and be able to complete these breach response.
Yeah. Which one calls out to you the most, Stacey, or none of the above?
I think all of the above, but particularly automation. Again, very optimistic with just the integration of more, machine learning and artificial intelligence tools that, intelligent automation will give us greater capabilities. I'm always just a huge fan of the continuous training and skill development, as I mentioned, and the continuous training at all levels of the organization and getting feedback on different points of view, I think is critical.
The one in the middle, what I'm seeing is the insurance. Anybody from the insurance industry in here? Okay, cool. Okay, hey. Coming your way. I'm seeing some of the insurance companies actually develop their own integrated IR platforms, and they want you all as the corporations to use their integrated IR platform. Think of that from a legal risk standpoint, right? And are you going to put your logs up there? And what did you say in your attestation to the insurance company regarding, oh, we have MFA, we have these types of controls, and now what are you putting up into the platform that they're going to host for you that might say, hey, we didn't do that, right? So I think if you're going to do that on-prem or use a third party to allow you to do that on-prem, and if you do it the right way, be able to blanket that under privilege at a moment's notice, depending upon what you're running into, and how do you do that, and enter into this Slack conversation we had like 5 minutes ago. So that's one. I agree with all the rest. So.
Dave, any thoughts and comments on that, the insurance aspect of it, or as you?
He was trying.
Yeah, I wouldn't give my insurer access to all my log data, but yeah.
I feel bad for the guys in the back room, like, oh no, yeah, nothing but love.
I'd say the insurance industry is really interesting for me. I worked with them as an investigator, and now Aon being a big broker and providing a lot of professional services in the insurance space. They have a lot of data to help you make great decisions. Right. So definitely take up having a broker, work with your broker, understand what attacks are prevalent, your industry, what's happening in your industry, the controls that matter most to insurers are going to be the controls that are most often responsible for a breach, right, if they're not there. So I'd say there's such a great partner overall to work with. If you're not utilizing that today, highly recommend creating that.
No, it's great. I mean, really, your brokers are your PMs. To run,
because they don't want to pay a lot of money.
No, so. Right, and they run interference between you and the insurance company. Not interference. Insurance is a huge work stream during any incident. Honestly, it's almost an unmanageable work stream. And your head of insurance and your CISO probably never really hang out except for once a year when they're doing their recertification attestation, unless you have an incident. And just that becomes a mammoth work stream.
And getting the right insurance is really hard now because there's all kinds of exclusions because of the risks that are changing so fast, whether it's war or it's sort of aggregated risk for third-party breaches. There's lots of changes in the industry, so it's fairly complex.
Sorry for the insurance cyber therapy session.
No, I'm excited about it.
Curious, you've all been career longs in this space. How has this changed over time? I'll throw it out there for anyone who wants to jump in on it. If there's anything different from
I think Andy said it didn't change, really.
I don't see a change there.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's scary. My first RSA was 2001, right? And some of these same themes were there, right? And I've been coming since, except for maybe the automation piece. No one was really thinking, okay, we can automate this, right? But I hate to say it, maybe it's job security for all of us, but these things are changing. But I'm really hopeful in what I'm seeing. Sort of some of the companies that are adapting platforms and thinking about this, they have, like you guys do in your interviewing people that actually do this for a living and seeing what the needs are and maybe putting products out there that will work. I'm excited for that, but I'll defer to the rest of the panel.
I'd say the one thing that always concerns me, there's these tipping points where there's a huge asymmetry that opens up in the industry. So remember, like early on when no one really knew about APT or China or Russia, people didn't understand how those attacks worked. And it was a huge tipping point when people understood and they understood the right tools to implement, how to defend against it. And I think we had hit another tipping point now where you have, we've all got MFA, it's working great, and all of a sudden, there's a lot of groups out there that can bypass MFA. And we're all thinking about non-phishable or phishing-resistant tokens, adaptive authentication, and it's a huge shift and a very easy attack vector. So there's some of these changes that I think every so often you see that really result in a huge change in the landscape.
Totally agree. We will publish the findings in the report, in more detail later in the spring. So info@commandzero.io for those interested. And thank you so much for attending this morning. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.